quilting friends. Well, today I want to show you some of my tips and how I approach my quilting as we start our 2020 Starlight Starbright block of the month. So I'm going to start by working on just this corner section here and show you how I approach that. And hopefully you'll get some tips along the way about what I do and how to end up with your blocks being perfecto. We're going to start by drawing a line on the back of our B squares, and I like to do this on a piece of sandpaper. This is a very fine sandpaper that I picked up from the home improvement store. I'm stuck there. And so it's just as fine as you can get is all you need. And then I attach mine to a clipboard. It makes it easy for me to find it, one, but it just gives me a solid surface to work on too. So I'm going to take my B squares and flip them over to the wrong side. And then I'll use my ruler here and line up. I'm going to have to stand up instead of doing this sitting down, but let's see. So I'm going to line up my lines. This diagonal line I'm lining up on the edge of my square, and then I'm scooching it so that I can see I'll have a pencil width there. And I'm just using a regular mechanical pencil here, which will make a line. What I like about the sandpaper is you see how it just held the fabric so it didn't wiggle and move while I drew my line. So there I have my nice line for working. I'm going to go ahead and put a line on my other 3 squares, and then I'll show them together. With my lines drawn on my squares now, I've put it right sides together with the other square that I'm going to be using for this pattern. And I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch from each side of this drawn line. So I like to start everything I do with what I call a leader, just a scrap of fabric that I sew on. And then the other thing I do is I will sew with my needle stopping in the down position. So my machine has a little button I can push, so it automatically will do that, which is really handy. And then I like to sew also with my stitch length just a wee bit shorter than normal. So on my machine I actually set it to a 2.3 for stitching here. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up this edge of my foot with this line here, and that will put me a 1/4 inch over, and so I am ready to go. And I'll take a few stitches off because I'm going to chain piece these. And when I'm chain piecing, well, when I'm doing any piecing, what I like to do, you'll notice I lift the presser foot up and I scoot the fabric up to right where the needle is bumping against the edge of that fabric. I'm trying to do this with the camera in my way. Here we go. And so that has stopped a lot of the issues of bunching up. Chain piecing helps do that too, but a lot of the issues of bunching up of the fabric when you start. And also I get a nice straight start to my edge. I don't have to find the edge as I'm getting started. It's already all lined up there to go. And I start kind of slow and then pick up speed to go across once I get going. And then I slow down again when I come to the other end to make sure again that I'm following this nice straight line. And I sew right off the edge and do the same thing again. And our final piece here. And then when I've finished, I use a little scrap of fabric from my ender and just sew right across that. And then I'm ready for when I come back to sew again. I'm all ready to just get started. Now I'm going to clip off my pieces I've chained, and I'm just going to go ahead and clip them apart here. And then clip off this little ender as well. And now what I need to do is simply turn these around the other side, and you can do whichever side you want to do. You could line it up on this side. For some reason I just have gotten in the habit of lining these up on my left side of my line, but it works just as well if you were to start it there. So here we go on the other side. The next thing I need to do is actually cut these apart. So I'm going to line up my ruler here on that line that I've drawn. Cut these apart. And then we have 2 half square triangles that we will press open. I'm going to go ahead and cut the rest of these and then press them to the dark side. Now I'm here with my wool pressing mat, and what we need to do is press our half square triangles open. So a lot of us, if you're new to quilting, you're used to, ironing is kind of a moving process. With quilting, we call it pressing because we just lift and set the iron down for the most part. And so I'm going to set this down. This is setting the seam on this piece, and I let it sit there for a few seconds, as you can see. And then I'll open this up and use my iron to kind of push that edge, and then lift up the iron and set it down in place. Again, I just let it sit there for a few minutes. I might turn it, let it sit again, but I don't rub. That can distort your pieces if you're rubbing, so just set your iron on it, let it sit for a few seconds, and then you have your piece all pressed. I will tell you that I have noticed a difference in how sharp and crisp my seams are when I switch to the wool pressing mat. I did this one, let's see if you can see this. I did this one with just my regular ironing board, and I don't know if you can see that the seam is not quite as crisp. It's got more of a roll to it, I guess. And so I have just noticed a difference, especially when you're doing some more intricate piecing, of how well the pieces lay. Now, one of the tricks, because these wool pressing mats are kind of pricey, one of the tricks I've done in the past that made a difference in this aspect was I just used a big fluffy towel and used that on my ironing board and then pressed on top of the towel, and that achieved a pretty nice. I noticed a difference in how well my seams were being pressed nice and crisp when I did the towel. Another trick you can do is while your piece is still hot, so pretend this is the iron, we've set the iron on, our piece is nice and hot, and then we just put a heavy book on it, and that also will help add that crease in there nicely for your piecing. So that's just one of the tricks for making sure you have nice sharp edges when you're edges when you press, so that helps with when you're lining things up. What we will often do then is what's called lock our seams together. So if I have 2 nicely pressed seams that fit in there, and you can see how well they're fitting there, they lock into place as we sew. When they're nice and crisp and smooth, that just makes that edge so much nicer for sewing together and getting right beautiful joints when you sew them together. So the pressing is important, so pay attention to that as you're going along on our quilt along. The next thing we need to do is trim our pieces to size. So in checking our instructions here, we need to have these trimmed to 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches, so a 2.5 inch square. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to line up my diagonal line with that seam line. And actually, on this one, I'm going to go ahead and turn it so you can see my 2.5 inch mark nice and clearly. So I've got my seam line lined up there, and then I'm going to trim. I'm putting nice firm pressure on my ruler. I'm going to trim the first 2 sides here. I trim right-handed, so if you're left-handed, you're going to have to make some adjustments to how this goes. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same thing on this side, lining up my 2.5 inch marks and my diagonal line once again. Now, what I have found works for me with piecing is I don't put the line right on top of my of where my fabric's cut. I move it so it snugs up to the edge. Just that little bit made a difference in helping me to get more accurate with my piecing. So for me, I have found that's what works. I'm going to trim off these other two edges. And then we have our half square triangle ready to go. To finish the corner section now, I've laid out the trimmed half square triangles with my A squares and my D squares, and I'm going to start sewing those together. Now again, one of the things I have found is I actually, let's see if I can zoom out here a little bit, show you my, maybe, I have, just pick up the camera and move it here. I have this little light at the end of my sewing machine, and notice it has a flexible thing, which I love, so I can focus my light in on this edge of my machine foot, and that I have found has been very important for getting my pieces to sew the way I want them to see. So for my accurate 1/4 inch seam, I have found that this foot that came with my machine works quite well if I line up my fabric. Can you see this little tiny line right there? I line up my fabric there and on the edge of the foot, but this light shining on it helps get rid of any shadows and everything, so I can see that my fabric is lined up exactly the way it needs to be. So I don't know if it's my eyes getting older or what, but I have just found that really has helped a good bit. So now I'm going to chain piece the half square triangles with the A and D squares I have. So again, I've got my leader and I'm lifting up my presser foot and I'm snugging that right up to where that needle is, again to give me a nice straight stitch as I sew. And I can see that my fabric is lined up nicely with my little line and with the edge of my presser foot. So here we go. I will just continue sewing these until I have them all put together into pairs. One of the things I mentioned to you when I was sewing the half square triangles together was that I slow down as I come to this edge, and I wanted to show you when I'm piecing that I do the same thing. I slow down as I'm coming to this edge, because now I've lost my guide here, and so what I kind of look at now is, do I have this, because this is a square piece, do I have things lined up so I can see that, look at that, I've got it nice and square across that part, and then as I sew slowly off my line, my guideline here, see how I have it so that it's nice and square with that line. And that's another, just a check to make sure that I'm sewing nice and square, because what I used to do when I first started quilting, you know, is zoom it along, and then when I came off the edge, I quite often found that I either wandered this way or I wandered that way, and so my corners were never straight. And so just by slowing down and kind of watching that angles as I go through to make sure my lines are lined up with things on the machine, then that has helped to end the problem with the corners not being straight and nice and square. So I'll finish these up, and then we'll go to the next step. To finish our corner unit, we're going to sew these two pairs that we have put together. And if we've pressed the way as indicated in the pattern, once again we will have, like we talked about earlier, we'll have those seams that lock together. So one seam is pressed this way and one seam is pressed that way, and they just, if you push them in to place, they just lock together nicely. And this works out well too. I am not going to bother putting a pin in this because you can see that my seam is pointing this way. So that means that as my needle comes down to it, it's going to push it firmly into the seam that's underneath as well. So I'll move these out of the way and get ready to sew here. Okay, so once again, I am going to snug this right up to my needle, making sure I'm lined up on this edge over here. And I'm going to start out kind of slowly because I am sewing over kind of a bulky seam. And then as I come to this, sometimes, this is where the pressing has really helped. Sometimes you'll have this sticking up in the way, and just having a little stiletto to kind of hold it down. And notice I'm going pretty slow through here. And once I have sewn over that seam, I'm going to check and make sure everything's still lined up. As I go here, hold it in place, and away I go. And then as I come to this, if you sew too quickly over this, sometimes your fabric will get pushed in a direction you don't necessarily want it to go. So just sew slowly, and again I'm making sure that I'm lined up so I have sewn straight off and didn't veer off one way or the other as I went sewing off of that. So those are the tips for helping to make the corner unit. And once you have mastered those half square triangles, we'll be using those a lot in the future quilt blocks. So just keep practicing on those, get those down and nice and accurate. I'm going to sew one more here, and then we'll clip off the one. Things lined up. And sometimes I use the stiletto at this point, and sometimes I don't. You just kind of have to. It's just a nice tip for getting that part all lined up, keeping those seams nice as you go. Okay, and I'm going to clip off the first one that I did, and we'll open it up and see how we look here. So, oops, there we go. Now you can maybe see it. So we can see how nicely our seams have lined up. We also have a 1/4 inch beyond our points, which is really important. Here we have the 1/4 inch again, because this is going to be our seam. And so if I had not sewn these accurately, that's when you end up losing. So if I had sewn this so that it was, you know, I don't have a 1/4 inch, I have less than a 1/4 inch there, then when I sew it together, I end up without that point showing. And that's what happened. That's how we lose our points, is not having our 1/4 inch beyond. So I think, but there's our corner unit. I think it's coming out nicely. And I'll take these over and finish sewing them and take them over and press them.